When I was like 13 or 14, I had no friends in school, and I would always go to either the library or to my town's local DVD rental and purchase shop. Yes, my town had one of those. And I remember wandering into that store one day, and I picked up a DVD copy of the movie Requiem for a Dream. And I was like, I know the music from this movie, and I hear people talk about it. I'll check this out. And so I did, and the film was horrifying and disgusting and horrible. But what I really remember from Requiem for a Dream, 10 or 11 years later, is not only the horrifying images of heroin abuse and sexual assault and everybody's lives being ruined by drug addiction. The image that stands out the most to me is this shot of Jennifer Connelly's character at the end of a pier. Jared Leto is constantly thinking about this, and eventually throughout the film, at least if I'm remembering correctly, Jennifer Connelly at the end of this pier comes to represent everything in his life that he cannot achieve. This is what I like to call the image of the unattainable woman, and we see it in a lot of different works in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's literally represented by a woman standing far away with her back to the camera/viewer, and other times it's more figurative. It's an emotional conflict where a man cannot connect to an important part of himself or his past or whatever, and that's represented by a love interest or a female character. But typically the unattainable woman, as I define her as a symbol in fiction, is that she represents all of the potential for characters and specifically the morality of the story. Usually, dynamic characters have to choose between wants and needs, with heroes choosing their needs and villains choosing their wants. In choosing their wants, characters usually lose access to their needs, but when they do choose their needs, they're usually given their wants as a reward. Now, the unattainable woman can either represent wants or needs, depending on the story, and typically, if she is a character's need, she is unobtained because the character chooses their want, or vice versa.
You're going down a path I can't follow.
More specifically, though, of course, at the most basic level, the unattainable woman is simply a representation of longing and desire. Longing and desire don't have to be negative traits, either in real life or storytelling, but they certainly can be in both life and in storytelling. So, with all of that said, let's take a couple minutes here to talk about everyone's favorite topic: women. So this is not going to be like the most scholarly deep dive into women as symbols ever. You can find tons of great feminist works on those things. But I don't think it is bold or new or daring to say that women specifically have long been used as a symbol for purity and morality in storytelling. This is a tradition which dates back centuries, from characters like Ophelia to Guinevere in the Arthurian legend, and even to Padme Amidala in those couple Star Wars movies that she's in. But at the same time, female characters are often symbols of sin and corruption, also in a tradition dating back centuries. I mean, in Western or Christian literature specifically, Eve, a female character, female figure, however you want to look at it, eats the apple, red, and curses humanity for forever. And then in the Christian canon, women menstruate as a punishment for Eve specifically being the one who eats the apple. So early on in Christian and Western literature, and then as we see later in horror, women are constantly associated with the color red, because red is always a symbol of evil, sin, temptation, whatever. However, even when female characters do not necessarily do anything wrong, and when they are pure, they can still be used as symbols of wrongdoing. For example, I mentioned Guinevere from the Arthurian legend and Padme from Star Wars, and both of these women are pretty good. They're noble of heart, they do the right thing. Guinevere, fumbles a little bit with Lancelot, but they're both also symbols of wrongdoing despite their potential or supposed purity, because how can a just man remain just in a world where he cannot love effectively? Arthur cannot effectively love Guinevere because she's in love with Lancelot, and Anakin cannot love Padme because what she represents is incompatible with the worldview that he comes to understand and represent as he becomes a Sith. All of this connects to the double-edged sword that we see in the Code of Chivalry, specifically in the story of Gawain and the Green Knight, where Gawain is stuck by the Code of Chivalry with the mistress of the house. He's naked and can't leave his bed, but also he cannot rebuke her advances because that would violate the Code of Chivalry. And this really all just boils down to the virgin and vixen stereotype that we have had a lot of female characters be reduced to over the years. Taylor Swift actually explains this whole problem of female characters really well in her song Lavender Haze, when she says, "The only kind of girl they see is a one-night or a wife." And when I say the problem of female characters, I'm not trying to put the blame on female characters. I'm saying that the way female characters in a lot of specific genres, especially, in early literature are portrayed, is, I don't want to say problematic, but it's simplistic and somewhat reductive in how society, and specifically those written works, often views women as either a one-night or a wife, as both pure and corrupt, and somehow in either way responsible for the problems of their male counterparts. And we really see this potential issue in writing the most in the horror genre, but we also see it pushed away the most in the horror genre. Just like most genres, horror has a bit of a duality to it. But specifically in horror, female sexuality has long been and always been punished, and female chastity is rewarded. This is very common cinematic language. If a female character, or even a male character, but especially a female character, gets up to the old sexual intercourse on screen, don't expect her to be around for very long. Whereas if a female character is moral and chaste and pure, she will probably survive in the classically explored and depicted final girl trope. And in horror, women have long maintained the role of Eve and the forbidden fruit as either something which cannot be obtained by the narrative, or something when obtained by the narrative results in unfound tragedy. Horror, like romance, is rife with longing and a yearning for something. But in romance, a longing and a yearning of something unattainable is usually cute and often rewarded by the end of the narrative. But in horror, that longing is horrifying and punished. Another symbol that I see pop up a lot in horror specifically are doors. And to be even more specifically, red doors. And to be even more specifically in a specific sense, we see a prominent red door in the 2017 A24 horror film, It Comes at Night. Now, It Comes at Night was, I feel, overlooked at the time of its release, and the people who did see it, at least audience-wise, said that was fucking horrible. But I saw it and I said, that was awesome. And critics saw it and they said, that was awesome. And in the intervening years, it's kind of, I don't want to say faded into obscurity, but nobody likes it as much as I do. Therefore, everybody else's opinion on it besides mine is wrong. So let's talk about It Comes at Night a little bit, and specifically red doors and how those red doors connect to the symbol of the unattainable woman in movies like Star Wars and Requiem for a Dream. Okay, so basically, if you're unfamiliar, the plot of It Comes at Night is we follow this family. There's 3 people in the family. There's Joel Edgerton, his wife, and his son, and also his father-in-law, who dies at the beginning. And there's some kind of plague, disease, we don't really know. Something bad is going on in the outside world, and they don't want to get sick. So they remain in this weird, isolated little house in the middle of the woods. Well, they come across this other family and let the other family live with them for a while, and then, of course, sickness gets into the house, and it's all horrible and sad and terrible. And that symbol is the red door. As Joel Edgerton explains, this red door is the only way in or out of the house. And so, the main character, Joel Edgerton's son, whose name is Travis, spends a lot of time looking at and dreaming about and thinking about this red door. Gateway to not just the outside world, but also to sickness and to death. The red door is what lets it into the house. It, to me, being fear, paranoia, corruption. And yet, the red door is only seen at night, fitting with the film's title and thesis that it comes at night. But the red door is associated with something else as well. It's also associated with the character of Kim, who is a woman, presumably I think in about her 20s, that Travis views sexually. He has feelings for Kim, he listens to Kim and her husband having sex, and he also has this weird dream of Kim spitting this black goo into his mouth, and something that is both erotic and, of course, horrifying. Because in horror, women are again usually reduced to either erotic or horrifying, and sometimes, as in the case of It Comes at Night, both. But in any sense, Travis longs for Kim and a connection to her or a connection to the outside world in general, and it is this yearning which gets him sick. The climax of the film is focused around the 2 families arguing about who is responsible for opening the door to let in a sick dog, which infects somebody in the family. And by the end of the film, it's never explicitly made clear who actually opened the door. But the point is that it doesn't really matter, because when the door is opened, everybody gets sick. When Eve eats the apple, everyone is kicked out of the Garden of Eden. The red door represents, again, a lot of things, both within the context of the film and I feel in the wider meta-narrative of horror in general. For me, in the purpose of this video, I think the red door is most clearly and closely linked to the character of Kim because Travis views them both as the same. They are things which he wants to be closer to and connect to, but which he is being denied by the social scenario that he happens to be in at the time. We have another prominent red door in the M. Night Shyamalan film, The Sixth Sense, which I just watched recently for the first time. In The Sixth Sense, red is also used as a symbol of death, but kind of like in an inverse way of how we see it in It Comes at Night. Rather than red being a gateway to death from the living, in The Sixth Sense, red is a symbol of separation between the dead and the living, because our main character is not somebody who's alive and fearful of death, it's somebody who is dead and fearful of death and wanting to be alive.
Do you know why you're afraid when you're alone? I do. I do.
The Sixth Sense is a film which is deeply rooted in longing, specifically the longing between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Our main character, Malcolm, played by Bruce Willis, is constantly trying to get through a door, and while it is not a red door, it has a red door handle. So for our purposes, it's the same thing. Red is again used to symbolize the line between life and death, and highlight longing just as it is in It Comes at Night. However, it's much more explicit in The Sixth Sense, where red appears whenever death or the supernatural is present, whereas in It Comes at Night, it just appears whenever human folly, which leads to death, is present. Malcolm as a character is, of course, a ghost. He's dead, and he doesn't realize that he's dead. Instead, he thinks that his marriage is simply falling apart because his wife, Anna, is unattainable to him. But she's unattainable because, again, he's deceased, and he must move on. Final scene of the film, the character, Anna, his wife, is even wearing red, and she says,
"Why did you leave me?"
This is when we get the reveal that Bruce Willis is dead, and Anna is, of course, still in the land of the living. And so it is not only Malcolm's character, but also Anna's character who are filled with longing and the desire to reach something unattainable. Visually, though, leading up to this twist, Anna is separated from Malcolm in basically every scene, and there's even a scene where Anna talks about longing when she is selling an engagement ring to a new couple and talks about items being kind of carriers for people who are no longer with us.
I think this piece, communicates a longing. I imagine that the woman who owned it loved a man that she couldn't be with.
And I think The Sixth Sense is interesting in our context of unattainable women because Anna doesn't necessarily represent anything bad. She doesn't represent any kind of failure. In fact, Bruce Willis's character Malcolm represents the same thing to her that she represents to him. Both characters have, for the most part, done the right thing and are good people, and yet they are still denied each other because they are separated by death. And it is only at the end of the film when Malcolm realizes this that he's able to potentially move on, turn that door handle, and accept that he will never again return to the unattainable woman because he is the unattainable man. They're separated by death, and no matter how hard you long for someone or something, you can never be reunited with them when death stands between you. And so that is why, obviously, death and an inability to move on from death or escape death is the ultimate horror, and specifically the ultimate horror of longing. The unattainable woman is not only a symbol of unattainable goals or stereotypes, but a symbol of desire, good and bad, and oftentimes the desire to defeat or overcome death. And I think this is used as a really effective symbol, actually, at the end of Scream 3, a movie that I don't particularly like, but which I think has a very powerful ending. This film ends with a door. Not a red door, but a door. And the film focuses on our main character, Sidney Prescott, dealing with her trauma from prior films and also her fear of death and her mother's death. In this sense, her mother being the unattainable woman, not in a sexual sense, but in an emotional sense. And yet Sidney herself was also an unattainable woman, so there's all sorts of layers there. But anyways, at the end of the film, Sidney leaves this door open because she is no longer afraid of what might come through it. Specifically, she's no longer afraid that death will pass through her door. This is a pretty bold breaking of genre conventions, but that's par for the course in a franchise like Scream, where the most notable breaking of conventions is that in the first film, Sidney famously does have sex with her boyfriend Billy, and yet does not get killed or punished as a result. And yet, as I mentioned, Sidney herself, in a way, is still an unattainable woman, specifically from Billy's point of view. And Billy, because he pursues his selfish wants, dies trying to reach the unattainable woman, because he's not trying to reach her to improve himself or to improve her. He's trying to reach her to get petty revenge. Revenge, once again, connected to Sydney's mother. Just another kind of interesting symbol is that in one of the most famous scenes in Scream, Billy tries to first get Sydney, sexually that is, by climbing through her window rather than passing through a door. And in the scene, he is denied entry to her. I didn't quite mean that as a weird pun, but I guess it works symbolically and literally. But the real horror of Scream is not just the romantic longing, but specifically the corruption and the commodification of longing. But of course, we cannot talk about longing and tragic longing and the horror of longing without first looking at something which is not horror at all, that being The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby is, of course, not horror, but it is, I feel, probably one of our most famous examples of the unattainable woman in fiction. The character of Daisy is in fact so unattainable that we see her at the beginning and for most of the film not even as a person, but simply as a light, and not a red light, but a green light. I don't know if that supports or destroys my entire thesis, but hey, whatever, it's worth talking about. But like most characters in horror rather than most characters in romance, Gatsby is punished and killed for his longing. He is punished for his reduction of Daisy to a symbol as something that he wants. In that sense, The Great Gatsby has much more in common with a horror film than a traditional romance, because Fitzgerald truly understands the horror of longing, specifically the horror of longing unfulfilled. Daisy can't save Gatsby. Gatsby has to save Gatsby. And of course, just like in horror, there are all sorts of other symbols and meanings attached to not just Daisy, but the green light and Gatsby themselves, and the real horror and longing of the American dream and all of these things, but that's a different video.
If I could just get back to the start. If I could just get back to the start, I could find it again. So I stopped. I stopped and I waited. I waited for a moment longer.
He knew his mind would never again be free to romp like the mind of God.
And I just let myself go.
Blossomed for him like a flower.
I knew it was a great mistake for a man like me to fall in love.
The unattainable woman as a symbol can't save everyone. Why? Because she's unattainable. Because she doesn't exist. Because women as portrayed in these works, whether it be Requiem for a Dream or The Great Gatsby or whatever, don't actually exist. Or at least they can't exist outside of the male mind as something of imagination. Because in these works, these characters are often reduced to, again, simplistic symbols, which in the real world, women, of course, are not. And so, when characters view these women only as symbols or a means to an end or a means to their goals or bettering themselves, they are usually punished by the narrative. But to tie it all together, the unattainable woman, the red door, all of these symbols are a Pandora's box that shouldn't be opened. They're the apple that shouldn't be eaten. That's because simply attaining these things does not actually give characters access to the things they desire. Remember, characters need to choose between wants and needs, and a character opens the box, opens the red door, or takes a bite of the apple, is almost always going to be choosing their want over their need. Red doors are a gateway to punishment, unattainable women are unattainable, and the only way a person, a character, a man, a society is going to improve is if it stops looking at people or things or symbols as far away items which will magically give them what they want, and instead take a look at the real horror, the real longing, which is inside of themselves and is, of course, a desire to be better, but an unwillingness to be better.